His deck, a sanctuary for family dinners and celebrations, was declared illegal, with threats of fines that could financially devastate his family. The HOA, led by the imperious Caroline Thatcher, smugly stated that rules are rules, dismissing Mark's evidence without so much as a glance. Confident in her untouchable authority, she assured him he had no chance of winning. But what Caroline didn't know was that Mark had a trump card that would turn the tables. When the truth came to light, the fallout shook the entire community. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Wilson stood on the porch of his house, clutching the envelope bearing the HOA logo. The letter looked official, with bold lettering and a seal that made it feel more like a court summons or a tax notice. He even chuckled briefly, thinking, probably just a mistake. But as he opened the envelope and scanned its contents, his heart sank. Your deck is in violation of HOA regulations and must be dismantled within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $5,000 per day of delay. Mark read the letter again, feeling a wave of anger and disbelief wash over him. How could this be possible? His property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. He'd confirmed it with the developer before buying the land. On top of that, the deck was built with all the proper city permits and inspections. He had everything in order. Mark walked into the kitchen and placed the letter on the table. His wife, Emma, was cooking dinner, and the sound of their children, Kylie and Jake, playing in the living room filled the house. The warmth of their home, the very comfort he had worked so hard to build, was now overshadowed by a heavy sense of foreboding. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, noticing the worried expression on his face. "The HOA," he said, his voice tight. "They're saying the deck is illegal and needs to be torn down." Emma stopped what she was doing, turning to him with a frown. "But that's impossible. You checked everything. It's all legal." "Legal or not, they're demanding it come down, and they're threatening fines if we don't comply." Mark sat down, running his hands through his hair. It felt as if the world he'd carefully constructed for his family was starting to collapse. He stepped outside onto the deck, the one he had poured so much effort into building. It had become the heart of their home, a place where the kids laughed, where friends gathered, and where evenings were spent under the stars. The fresh scent of the wood lingered in the air, and the sunlight danced on the smooth planks. In that moment, one question echoed in his mind. How could anyone be so entitled as to demand this be destroyed? And really, who wouldn't feel the same way? As I imagine it. You spend months planning, pouring your time, money, and energy into creating a space that your family loves. It becomes a sanctuary, a place of joy. And suddenly, someone shows up and tells you it has to be torn down. No explanation, no reason that makes sense. It's outrageous. Mark stood, determination settling into his expression. He wasn't about to let this go. If he gave in now, the HOA would only find more ways to interfere with his life. This was his home, his land, and his deck. No one had the right to take that away from him. That night, Mark barely slept. He combed through documents, old emails with the developer, and property records, piecing together everything he needed to prove his rights. He knew this was just the beginning of a long uphill battle, but he also knew he couldn't afford to back down. This was his first step in what would become a fight for justice. The HOA office was housed in a modest building just a few blocks from Mark's neighborhood. As he stepped inside, the sterile, overly polished interior greeted him with its cold sterility. It was the kind of place that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Walls painted in muted grays, a stiff receptionist desk that felt more like a barrier, and an overpowering scent of air freshener masking any sense of humanity. Mark took a deep breath, gripping the documents he had meticulously gathered the night before. He was ready to present his case, to show proof that his deck, his pride and joy, was fully compliant with city regulations and not subject to HOA jurisdiction. Surely, a reasonable explanation would clear this up. Behind the desk sat Caroline Thatcher, the HOA chairperson. She was a woman of precise movements, sharp features, and an aura that could freeze a summer afternoon. As Mark approached, her cold smile didn't waver, but it also didn't reach her eyes. "Yes?" she said, her voice as crisp as the papers stacked perfectly in front of her. Mark introduced himself and began to explain, laying his documents on the desk between them. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. My property is outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Here's proof. This is the developer's original documentation, and this is my permit from the city." Caroline barely glanced at the papers before folding her hands. "Our records indicate otherwise. Your property is subject to HOA regulations, and you are required to comply." "But these are legal documents," Mark insisted, his voice firm but steady. "They clearly show—" She cut him off, her tone curt. "We have our own records, Mr. Wilson. As a member of this community, you are obligated to follow our rules." End of discussion. Mark's frustration simmered. She hadn't even looked at his evidence, dismissing him with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. It was infuriating. How could someone ignore clear facts so easily? He wanted to push back, but her demeanor warned him that this wasn't the place to escalate. Not yet. Defeated, but not defeated, Mark gathered his papers and left, his mind racing with what to do next. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just a deck. It felt personal, like a power play, designed to make him bend to their will. That evening, as he settled into his usual routine, Mark noticed something unusual. His phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. It included a link to the HOA's online portal, where violations were publicly listed. His deck was there, photographed and tagged as a severe infraction. The post accused him of disregarding community standards, and worse, it was visible to all his neighbors. Mark's stomach sank. The comments had already begun. Another rule breaker who thinks they're above everyone else. Why do people even move here if they don't want to follow the rules? I hope they make him take it down. The sting of public humiliation hit hard. This wasn't just about rules or fines anymore. It was an attack on his character, an attempt to turn his neighbors against him. Later, as he sat with Emma in their living room, she placed a reassuring hand on his. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady. But Mark could see the worry in her eyes. Imagine the betrayal he must have felt at that moment. You trust your community, your neighbors, to share a sense of mutual respect. And then suddenly, you're the target of baseless accusations, your name smeared in public for simply standing up for what's right. It's hard not to feel both angry and alone. But Mark wasn't the type to back down. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let this slide. Not now, not ever. Mark sat at his dining room table late into the night, his laptop illuminating the determined look on his face. He had gathered every piece of documentation he could find, property deeds, permits, correspondence with the developer, all meticulously organized. But none of it seemed to matter to Caroline. He realized that if he was going to fight back, he needed more. The next morning, he drove to the city archives. The building was old and imposing, with rows of filing cabinets and shelves full of dusty records. The clerk at the front desk raised an eyebrow when Mark explained what he was looking for, but led him to the section that held the development plans for his neighborhood. Hours passed as Mark sifted through the files, scanning maps and documents, until finally he found what he needed, a clear boundary map that showed his property outside the HOA's jurisdiction. His pulse quickened as he printed the map and attached it to his growing pile of evidence. Armed with this new proof, Mark returned to the HOA office the next day, his determination unwavering despite the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He stepped inside, feeling the same cold atmosphere that had greeted him before, and made his way to Caroline's desk. She looked up, her icy demeanor unchanged. "Back again, Mr. Wilson?" Mark placed the map and supporting documents on her desk, his voice calm but firm. "This map, issued by the city, clearly shows that my property is not within the HOA's jurisdiction. I'd appreciate it if you'd take a look." Caroline glanced at the papers briefly before leaning back in her chair. Mr. Wilson," she began, her tone condescending, "we recently passed new amendments that expand our jurisdiction to include properties like yours. So regardless of what this map says, you are now part of the HOA." Mark's jaw clenched. "Amendments? I wasn't notified of any changes." "It was decided during a board meeting," she replied coolly. "It's your responsibility to stay informed." Her dismissive attitude hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He realized she wasn't interested in fairness or logic. This was about power. Without another word, he gathered his papers and left, his frustration now burning into anger. That evening, Mark sat on his deck, staring out at the yard that had once brought him so much peace. The injustice of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he wasn't ready to give up. If Caroline wouldn't listen to reason, maybe others would. Over the next few days, Mark began speaking with his neighbors, starting with those he knew best. He wanted to find out if anyone else had faced similar issues with the HOA. To his surprise, it didn't take long for the stories to come pouring in. One neighbor, an elderly man named Frank, recounted how he'd been forced to tear down a shed he'd used for decades to store gardening tools. "They said it was an eyesore," Frank muttered bitterly, "but it was on my property, and no one ever complained before." Another neighbor, a young mother named Lisa, explained how she'd been fined for planting flowers in her front yard that weren't on the HOA's approved list. "I just wanted my house to feel a little more like home," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Now I'm stuck with these bland shrubs they made me put in instead." As Mark listened, he realized that he wasn't alone. The HOA had been overstepping its bounds for years, bullying residents into compliance with arbitrary rules. It wasn't just about his deck anymore. It was about standing up for the entire community. That night, Mark sat down with Emma to share what he had learned. "This isn't just about us," he said, his voice resolute. "They've been doing this to everyone. If we don't fight back, they'll just keep getting away with it." Emma nodded, her eyes filled with both worry and pride. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. Together with his neighbors, he was ready to take on the HOA and fight for what was right. Mark realized he was up against a formidable opponent. Caroline's smug dismissal of his evidence and the so-called amendments that seemed to appear out of nowhere left him no choice. This was a fight he couldn't win alone. Determined to bring in reinforcements, he reached out to Julia Hammond, a sharp and experienced attorney who had built her career taking on HOAs and winning. Julia's office was a stark contrast to the HOA's cold, impersonal space. Her desk was organized but welcoming, with family photos and an array of legal books that spoke to her expertise. As Mark recounted his ordeal, Julia listened intently, taking notes and occasionally nodding. Her calm yet confident demeanor was exactly what Mark needed. When he finished, Julia leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Mark, you've come to the right place. HOAs often overreach, thinking homeowners won't fight back. Let's see how strong their case really is." She immediately set to work, poring over the HOA's bylaws and amendments. Mark sat across from her, watching as she flipped through documents, occasionally muttering to herself. Hours turned into days of collaboration, and the more they dug, the more cracks they found in the HOA's armor. The breakthrough came late one evening. Julia leaned over her desk, holding a copy of the so-called amendments Caroline had cited. "Here it is," she said, her eyes lighting up with triumph. "These amendments were never officially voted on by the community. Without a formal vote, they're completely invalid." Mark felt a surge of hope. "You're sure?" Julia nodded. "Absolutely. They violated their own rules, and that's not all. Look at this." She held up another document, a financial report the HOA had filed. Mark squinted at the numbers, not understanding what he was looking at. Julia explained, "This shows that a portion of the fines collected from homeowners went toward miscellaneous expenses. But when I cross-referenced those expenses with receipts, it turns out a significant chunk of that money was used for things like Caroline's travel expenses and catering for private events." Mark's jaw dropped. "She's been using the HOA funds for herself?" "Exactly," Julia confirmed. "This is not just unethical, it's illegal, and it gives us all the leverage we need." Mark and Julia sat down to plan their next move. Julia outlined a strategy to present their findings to the board with the threat of legal action looming if the HOA didn't back down. "They'll try to bluff their way out of this," she warned, "but we have the evidence. If they push back, we'll take them to court." Mark felt a mix of emotions: relief that he wasn't fighting alone, anger at the extent of Caroline's deceit, and determination to see this through. As he left Julia's office that evening, he couldn't help but think about how many others in his community had been victims of the HOA's overreach. The next morning, Mark woke up feeling a renewed sense of purpose. With Julia on his side and the truth finally coming to light, he was ready to confront Caroline and the HOA. This wasn't just about his deck anymore. It was about holding them accountable and standing up for what was right. And honestly, isn't that what we all want? To know that the systems meant to protect us can't be abused by those in power. Mark was about to show Caroline that no one is above the rules, not even her. When Mark filed the official request to nullify the HOA's demands, he hoped it would signal the beginning of the end of his ordeal. But instead, it was like poking a hornet's nest. Caroline responded swiftly and harshly, wielding the HOA's power like a weapon. The first sign of her retaliation came in the form of a letter delivered by certified mail. The envelope was thick, its contents brimming with legal jargon, but the message was clear. The HOA was imposing additional fines on Mark for ongoing violations and had issued a warning of potential legal action. The justification? His deck was now being labeled as a safety hazard, allegedly posing a risk to the community. Mark stared at the letter, his frustration mounting. How could a deck built to code and inspected by city officials suddenly be a danger to anyone? It was absurd, but it wasn't just the fines. Soon after, whispers began to circulate through the neighborhood. "She's telling people you're misusing community resources," Emma said one evening, her tone laced with worry. Mark frowned. "What does that even mean?" "She's saying you've been using HOA funds to fight the board," Emma explained. "It's ridiculous, but some people are starting to believe it." Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't enough for Caroline to go after his property. She was now attacking his character. And worse, it was working. The pressure began to mount. At first, it was subtle. A few neighbors stopped waving when they saw him outside, their smiles replaced with cautious glances. But then it became more overt. One evening, as Mark was working in his yard, a neighbor walked by and muttered under their breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "Some people think they're above the rules." Not everyone turned against him, though. A handful of neighbors reached out, offering quiet words of support. "You're doing the right thing," Frank said, shaking Mark's hand firmly. The older man, who had been forced to tear down his shed, had become one of Mark's strongest allies. "Don't let her bully you like she's bullied the rest of us." But others were too afraid to take a stand. Lisa, the young mother fined for planting flowers, confided in Mark during a late-night conversation. "I agree with you," she said, her voice trembling, "but I can't risk getting on Caroline's bad side again. I can't afford more fines." Mark couldn't blame her. The HOA wielded its authority with such intimidation that even those who sympathized with him hesitated to speak out. It was a lonely, uphill battle. The tipping point came when Mark received notice that Caroline had filed a formal lawsuit against him, claiming his deck violated safety standards and endangered the community. The legal jargon was dense, but Julia, ever the sharp attorney, quickly saw through it. "This is a scare tactic," Julia said firmly, tossing the papers onto the table in frustration. "There's no basis for this claim. Your deck was approved by the city and doesn't pose any safety risks. She's just trying to intimidate you into backing down." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And it's working. People are turning against us, Julia. She's poisoning the whole neighborhood." Julia leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mark, listen to me. This is exactly what bullies like Caroline do. They use fear to control people. But you've already done more than most by standing up to her. Don't give her the satisfaction of seeing you fold now." Her words reignited the fire inside him. He wasn't just fighting for his deck anymore. He was fighting to expose the corruption and abuse of power that had gone unchecked for too long. At home, the strain was evident. The Wilson family had always been close-knit, but the constant pressure was taking its toll. Emma tried to keep things as normal as possible for the kids, but even they could sense the tension. "Why are people being mean to Dad?" Kylie asked one evening, her innocent question cutting deeper than any insult from a neighbor ever could. Emma knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Sometimes standing up for what's right can be hard," she said gently, "but your dad is doing this for all of us." Mark overheard the exchange from the next room, and it strengthened his resolve. He couldn't let Caroline win. not just for his family, but for every neighbor who had been silenced, every homeowner who had been unfairly fined, and every community member who had lost faith in the system meant to protect them. The battle was far from over, but Mark was ready. He wasn't fighting alone anymore, and with Julia's help, he was determined to prove that no one, not even Caroline, was above the law. The day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table beside Julia Hammond, his attorney, who exuded calm confidence. Across the aisle sat Caroline Thatcher, flanked by the HOA's legal counsel, her expression as composed and frosty as ever. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, as if everyone present knew this was more than just a fight over a deck. It was a battle over justice. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a firm but fair demeanor, entered the room, and the proceedings began. Julia rose to make her opening statement, her voice steady and clear as she outlined the facts of the case. This is not simply a matter of a homeowner failing to comply with HOA regulations, she began, her tone resolute. It is a case of overreach and abuse of power by an organization meant to protect, not exploit, the residents it serves. Mark felt a flicker of hope as he watched the judge nod slightly, clearly engaged. The first piece of evidence Julia presented was the boundary map from the city archives. As she laid it out on the overhead projector, the clear lines of jurisdiction illuminated the room. This map, she explained, was issued by the city and shows the exact boundaries of the HOA's authority. Mr. Wilson's property lies outside those boundaries. The judge leaned forward, studying the map intently. Caroline's attorney attempted to object, claiming the map was outdated, but Julia countered smoothly, producing a certificate of validity that confirmed the document's accuracy. The next piece of evidence was even more damning, a series of financial reports from the HOA. Julia handed copies to the judge, pointing to line items labeled miscellaneous expenses. Upon closer examination, Julia continued, these expenses include personal charges made by Miss Thatcher, such as luxury travel and private catering. These funds were collected from homeowners under the guise of enforcement fines. Gasps rippled through the small audience in the courtroom. Mark stole a glance at Caroline, whose composed facade had cracked ever so slightly. Then came the recordings. Julia had managed to obtain minutes and audio files from previous HOA meetings, exposing the lack of transparency in their decision-making process. Here, Julia said, pressing play on one recording, we can hear Miss Thatcher discussing the so-called jurisdictional amendments. Not only were these amendments never put to a community vote, but they were also implemented unilaterally, in clear violation of the HOA's own bylaws. The room fell silent as Caroline's voice echoed through the speakers, discussing how she intended to enforce the new rules without informing the residents. The judge's expression hardened, her disapproval evident. When it was Caroline's turn to testify, she tried to redirect the narrative. She painted Mark as a disruptive force in the community, accusing him of undermining the HOA's authority and creating unnecessary conflict. He's refused to cooperate at every turn, she said, her voice laced with indignation. His actions have caused division among the residents and jeopardized the integrity of our community. Julia stood to cross-examine. Miss Thatcher, are you aware that the deck in question was built with proper city permits and is fully compliant with local safety codes? Caroline hesitated, but eventually conceded. Yes, but it's still... Still what? Julia interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. Still a violation of rules that were never legally established? Or perhaps it's simply an inconvenience to your agenda? Caroline faltered, her composure slipping further. In her closing argument, Julia addressed the heart of the matter. This case is about more than a deck, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those in positions of authority cannot abuse their power without consequence. Mr. Wilson stood up, not just for himself, but for every resident who has ever felt silenced or exploited by those meant to serve them. The judge called a recess to deliberate. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as Mark sat, his hands clenched tightly together. This was it, the culmination of months of stress, fear, and determination. When the judge returned, her decision was swift and decisive. The court finds that the HOA acted outside its jurisdiction in attempting to enforce regulations on Mr. Wilson's property. Furthermore, The evidence presented today shows a clear pattern of financial mismanagement and procedural violations by Ms. Thatcher. The amendments are hereby deemed invalid, and the HOA is ordered to cease all enforcement actions against Mr. Wilson immediately. The relief that washed over Mark was overwhelming. He turned to Julia, who gave him a small, triumphant smile. As the courtroom emptied, Caroline sat motionless, her once unshakable confidence now replaced with defeat. Outside, Mark took a deep breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Julia placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You did it," she said. "You stood your ground and you won." Mark nodded, gratitude and determination filling his heart. This victory wasn't just for him. It was a message to everyone in the community that standing up to injustice was worth it, no matter how powerful the opponent. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional creak of a chair. Mark sat beside Julia Hammond, his attorney, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. The stakes were higher than ever, and the culmination of months of stress, research, and preparation would be decided here. Across the room, Caroline Thatcher sat with her own legal team, her face a mask of calm confidence. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. She was a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority that demanded respect. As everyone took their seats, the trial began. Julia stood, her voice steady and commanding, as she delivered her opening statement. "Your Honor, this case is not about a homeowner refusing to follow rules. It's about abuse of power, financial misconduct, and the unlawful actions of an HOA that has overstepped its bounds," she declared, glancing briefly at the audience before focusing on the judge. "Today, we will show that Mr. Wilson's property is not within the HOA's jurisdiction, and that the actions taken against him were both unjustified and illegal." Mark felt a wave of reassurance as Julia spoke. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was about accountability and standing up to those who thought they were untouchable. The first piece of evidence Julia presented was the city-issued boundary map. Projected onto the screen for all to see, it clearly showed the HOA's jurisdiction outlined in bold, and Mark's property, just outside that line, was marked in another color. This map, Julia explained, was obtained from the city archives and verified as accurate and up-to-date. It clearly shows that Mr. Wilson's property is not, and never has been, part of the HOA's jurisdiction. Caroline's attorney stood to object, claiming that the map was outdated. But Julia, always prepared, produced a certification from the city, confirming the document's validity. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable but attentive. Next, Julia moved on to the financial records. She handed copies to the judge and projected the key sections on the screen. "These are financial statements submitted by the HOA," Julia began, her tone calm but pointed. "Under the category of miscellaneous expenses, we found charges for luxury travel, private catering, and other personal expenditures made by Miss Thatcher herself. These funds were collected through fines imposed on residents, including Mr. Wilson." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Mark, who had seen these records before, felt the weight of the moment. Caroline's calm facade began to crack, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Thatcher, do you have an explanation for these charges?" Caroline's attorney quickly interjected, claiming the expenses were related to community events and necessary administrative costs. But Julia countered with receipts showing the payments were for personal vacations and private dinners. Finally, Julia presented the recordings of HOA meetings, which had been obtained through residents who were fed up with the lack of transparency. "In these recordings," Julia explained, "we hear Miss Thatcher and other board members discussing amendments to expand HOA jurisdiction. Not only were these amendments never voted on by the community, but they were also implemented without proper notice, violating the HOA's own bylaws." As the audio played, Caroline's voice filled the courtroom. In one clip, she could be heard saying, "The homeowners don't need to know all the details. As long as we enforce the rules, they'll fall in line." The judge's expression hardened, her disapproval evident. When it was Caroline's turn to testify, she tried to turn the focus back onto Mark. Mr. Wilson has been a disruptive presence in our community," she said, her voice laced with indignation. "His refusal to comply with HOA regulations has created unnecessary conflict. and undermine the unity of our neighborhood. Julia stood to cross-examine, her tone calm but firm. Miss Thatcher, are you aware that the deck in question was built with proper permits and inspected by city officials? Caroline hesitated. Yes, but... And are you also aware, Julia continued, that the so-called jurisdictional amendments you referenced were never legally enacted? Caroline's composure faltered further, and her responses grew evasive. In her closing argument, Julia addressed the heart of the case. This trial is about more than one homeowner, she began, her voice filled with conviction. It's about the abuse of power by an organization meant to serve its community. It's about holding those in positions of authority accountable when they exploit that authority for personal gain. Mr. Wilson stood up not only for himself, but for every homeowner who has ever felt silenced or exploited. The courtroom was silent as the judge retired to deliberate. Mark sat, his hands clenched tightly together, his heart pounding in his chest. The minutes felt like hours. When the judge returned, her decision was swift and clear. The court finds in favor of Mr. Wilson. The HOA acted outside its jurisdiction, and the amendments cited are invalid. Furthermore, the financial misconduct presented today warrants further investigation. The HOA is ordered to cease all enforcement actions against Mr. Wilson immediately, and Ms. Thatcher's conduct will be referred to the appropriate authorities for review. Relief flooded through Mark as the judge delivered her ruling. Julia turned to him with a small, triumphant smile. Outside the courtroom, Mark took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling lighter than he had in months. Julia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said. "You stood your ground and won." Mark nodded, gratitude and determination filling his heart. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a message that no one is above the law, not even those who think they hold all the power. The battle was over, and life at the Wilsons' home finally began to settle. The tension that had hung in the air for months slowly dissipated, replaced by the quiet hum of normalcy. On sunny afternoons, the deck that had been at the center of their struggle now served its intended purpose, a place of joy and peace. Mark stood on the deck one evening, watching the golden light of sunset spill across the wooden planks. The scent of freshly watered flowers wafted from the garden below, blending with the faint aroma of grilled vegetables Emma was preparing for dinner. Kylie and Jake were playing a board game at the patio table, their laughter filling the yard with a warmth that seemed to chase away the shadows of the past. The deck had become more than just a structure. It was a testament to perseverance, a physical reminder that standing up for what's right can make a difference. For Mark, it symbolized the strength of his family and the importance of community. The ripple effects of Mark's victory were felt throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began sharing their own stories of unjust fines and arbitrary rules. Frank, the elderly man forced to tear down his shed, approached Mark one morning with a smile and a handshake. "You did it," Frank said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You stood up to them, and because of you, the rest of us can too." Lisa, the young mother who had been fined for planting flowers, stopped by with a small potted plant as a thank you gift. "It's not much," she said shyly, "but I just wanted you to know how much we appreciate what you've done. You gave us the courage to stand up for ourselves." Mark accepted the gift with a smile, placing it on the deck's railing. "It's not just about me," he replied. "It's about all of us coming together." And that's exactly what started to happen. The community, once fractured and silenced by fear of retaliation, began to unite. Residents formed a new group to advocate for fairer practices and greater transparency within the HOA. Caroline Thatcher was removed from her position, and a new board was elected, one that pledged to prioritize the needs of the community over personal agendas. For the Wilsons, the return to normal life was a welcome change. But even as the days passed and the drama faded into memory, they couldn't forget the lessons they'd learned. One evening, as the family sat on the deck enjoying a quiet dinner under the glow of string lights, Emma turned to Mark. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You didn't just fight for us, you fought for everyone here." Mark took her hand, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but it was worth it. If we don't stand up to bullies like Caroline, they'll just keep taking more and more." Emma nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "And now everyone knows that it's possible to win. That's a powerful thing. The deck continued to serve as a gathering place, not just for the Wilson family, but for the entire neighborhood. Barbecues, game nights, and quiet afternoons with friends became the new norm. Each event felt like a small celebration of the strength and unity they had all found in the face of adversity. For Mark, the journey had been a reminder of what really mattered: family, community, and the courage to stand up for what's right. He hoped his story would inspire others, not just in his neighborhood, but anywhere people felt powerless against those who misused their authority. And isn't that the lesson we all need to hear? No matter how daunting the opponent, no matter how hopeless the fight may seem, standing up for justice is always worth it. The Wilson story proves that even against the odds, resilience and unity can lead to triumph. So, the next time you face an uphill battle, remember, even the strongest forces can be challenged when you stand firm in your beliefs. Just like the Wilsons, you might find that your courage inspires others to join you, and together, you can achieve something remarkable.